It's worth stating plainly at the start of this final video, rest matters enormously, and it is not, on its own, a complete answer to burnout. Sleep restores the body, it does much less for what recovery researchers call psychological detachment, genuinely switching off from the demands, decisions, and people pulling at you, rather than simply resting your body while your mind stays half engaged with everything still waiting. This is why so many people return from a holiday, or even a genuine period of time off, feeling only marginally better than when they left. The body rested. The underlying structural conditions that produce the burnout, the workload, the unclear boundaries, the identity built around being endlessly useful, didn't change at all, and rushed back in to refill the space the moment normal life resumed. Genuine recovery, then, has to work on two levels simultaneously: restoring the nervous system's capacity to actually rest and addressing the structural conditions that depleted it in the first place. The rest of this video works through both, in practical, specific terms, rather than vague encouragement to take more time for yourself. Recovery research has found that short, genuine bursts of disengagement, spaced throughout an ordinary day, do measurable work against chronic stress. Closing your eyes for 2 minutes with your phone out of reach, stepping outside without your phone at all, a handful of properly slow, deliberate breaths instead of the shallow, quick ones stress tends to produce. These micro-recoveries don't erase months or years of accumulated deficit on their own, but they interrupt the daily compounding, which matters enormously across weeks and months. The practical advantage of micro-recovery is accessibility. It doesn't require a holiday, a schedule overhaul, or permission from anyone else. A useful starting practice is picking 3 fixed points in an ordinary day, perhaps mid-morning, after lunch, and early evening, and protecting 90 seconds at each one for genuine disengagement. No multitasking, no scrolling, just stopping. Over several weeks, this builds a different baseline, even before anything larger has changed. This isn't a substitute for larger structural change, covered later in this video, but it's an achievable starting point on the hardest days, when bigger change still feels out of reach. For many people, the single most important recovery step is also the most uncomfortable. Rebuilding boundaries around time, energy, and commitments, even when doing so triggers real guilt. That guilt is worth naming honestly rather than treating as a stop sign. It is very often inherited, learned early, and not actually evidence that setting the boundary is wrong. A practical starting exercise. Before agreeing to anything new this week, pause for 3 seconds and ask honestly, do I have genuine capacity for this? Or am I agreeing to avoid the discomfort of saying no? This alone doesn't fix an already overloaded schedule, but it stops the deficit from growing further while the larger recovery work continues. For existing commitments that are clearly unsustainable, a useful reframe is treating the conversation as information rather than confrontation. I want to keep doing this well, and right now I genuinely can't at this level, is honest, respectful, and far more sustainable than silently resenting the commitment while continuing to overextend. Boundaries rebuilt this way rarely damage the relationships or roles people fear losing. More often, they protect those relationships and roles by making your continued involvement sustainable, rather than a countdown to eventual burnout-driven withdrawal or resentment. One of burnout's quieter effects is a kind of emotional flatness. Good news and bad news both landing with less weight than they used to, a general sense of going through the motions, even with things that once felt meaningful. Recovery includes deliberately, gently reconnecting with genuine interest and care, rather than waiting passively for it to return on its own. This reconnection tends to work better in small, low-stakes doses than in grand gestures. Revisiting a hobby for 15 minutes, reaching out to someone you've been too depleted to properly engage with, noticing one small thing that genuinely interests you today, even briefly. These small acts don't force feeling back immediately, but they keep the pathway open, so that as the underlying exhaustion eases, there's still something there to reconnect with. It's worth being patient with this specific part of recovery. Emotional flatness tends to be one of the slower symptoms to lift, often trailing behind physical energy and cognitive clarity by weeks. That lag is normal, not a sign that something is permanently broken. Burnout recovery is genuinely difficult to do entirely alone, and yet asking for help is frequently one of the hardest steps for exactly the kind of person most prone to burnout in the first place. Capable, self-reliant, used to being the one others depend on rather than the reverse. Reframing this is worth doing deliberately. Needing support during burnout is not evidence of failure. It is an accurate, honest response to a genuinely depleted system, the same way anyone would need support recovering from a physical illness that had gone on too long. A practical starting point is naming the need specifically, rather than vaguely, to one trusted person. Not, "I'm a bit tired," but "I think I'm properly burnt out and I need some real support right now." Specific requests are also easier for others to actually act on. Asking someone to take one concrete task off your plate this week is more useful for both of you than a general hope that things will somehow ease. Where burnout is severe, prolonged, or tangled with symptoms of depression or anxiety, it's genuinely worth speaking to a GP or a qualified therapist, rather than navigating recovery entirely through self-help alone. There is no failure in that step. It is simply using the appropriate level of support for the size of what you're actually carrying. Recovery from significant burnout is rarely quick. Depending on severity and duration, meaningful recovery often takes months rather than weeks, with progress that looks more like a gradual, uneven upward trend than a single clean turning point. Expecting rapid, linear improvement tends to produce discouragement that isn't warranted by how recovery actually works. The more important distinction, covered throughout this series, is between recovering once and recovering on a loop. Rest and coping tools help you survive an unsustainable situation. Lasting recovery requires an honest look at what actually produced the burnout: chronic overcommitment, invisible boundaries, an identity too tightly bound to usefulness, and a genuine structural change to those conditions, not simply enough rest to tolerate them again until the deficit rebuilds. This week, Series 15 named an exhaustion that shows up to every meeting, every commitment, every single day, while looking from the outside like nothing much is wrong. You now have language for what's actually happening, and a concrete, practical framework for both recovering and building something more sustainable from here. What you build with those tools from this point forward is entirely yours. Thank you for spending this week with us. This has been Healing Through Thoughts, and we'll see you in next week's series.